Okay, this is the last lecture of the semester. This is week 14. Next week is week 15, which is the last week of classes. And that time will be time for you to catch up on stuff that you haven't finished already. And go back and correct things that maybe you got partial credit on, because you're always welcome to redo assignments that you didn't get full credit on. And I will be available in both in BU 210 and online in my WebEx room from 9 till 10 next Tuesday. And that's not a time for general office hours. That's time devoted to this class. So you don't have to worry about maybe other people coming in with questions. All right. So I'll post an announcement about that and other important end of the semester stuff, sometime this week. All right. Our last topic that we're going to cover is AJAX. And one of the best ways to demonstrate AJAX is this. Let's say that I wanted to search something on Google. Let's say I wanted to search HTML. All right. So I start typing in this box, H. All right. I see a list of everything that contains H. This contains some local stuff that I did. T, M, L. It's not working very well. Try this on a different browser. Here we go. I type in H. There we go. That's the effect. I'm not sure why it didn't do that in Chrome, but I type in H and it shows me the top results, the top 10 results, it looks like, give or take. That starts with H. Home Depot, Huntington Bank, Hobby Lobby, Harbor Freight Tools, whatever that is, Honey Baked Ham, Hulu, Hotmail, How Many Days Till Christmas. All right, those are the top 10 or so search results that are an H. Then I type in a T. T. It shows me things that start with HT. You can type M, and then it came up with probably what I'm looking for, HTML. All right, but let's think about this from the model. The question I would raise is, does this seem more like client-side code, or does it seem more like server-side code? So think about that for a second. And it actually seems like both, all right? And there's different aspects of it that are like client-side code. There's different aspects of it that are like server-side code. It is like client-side code because the change, when I type something in, the change happens on my current screen. In other words, we don't see the page flicker. What do I mean by flicker? If I refresh this page, at least some of the times the page like flickers. All right, you can see it, and the flicker is it rewriting itself, redrawing the page. Because we've gone out, when we hit refresh, we've gone out and requested a new copy of the page. So therefore, it has to redraw the whole page. That's not happening here. When I type in an H, that shows up on the same page that I was before. And that's client-side behavior, because remember, what does client-side JavaScript do? Client-side JavaScript allows us to change something about the page without requesting another copy of the page from the server. So that very much looks like client-side code. What looks like server-side code is this. So I type in a CSS, it narrows it down to things that start with CSS. That implies that it's looking at some database somewhere, because there's no way that this could have been downloaded as part of the HTML page and JavaScript page, right? This looks like a database of every Google search term. So if I type in AJAX, for example, I get a list of a lot of things related to AJAX, but not necessarily programming. But if I type in programming, then I get it. So the client-side aspect of this is that the page refreshes, or I'm sorry, the page doesn't refresh. The page redraws only portions of the screen. All right. And that saves having to go and request a new page from the server and redrawing. So it saves time in doing that. They could have written this server-side code, but it would have been clunkier because the page would have to download and then you'd have to draw those in. Here, it makes that appear as soon as you type a key. Yeah, the fact that it has access to virtually every search term that Google can search for means it's probably hitting the web server to get those terms, because there's no way we could practically do that on the client. All right. The web page would be ginormous, all right, to use a technical term. All right, because to have all those search terms in an array or in something to look up an XML file or something like that, that would be so difficult to accomplish in terms of, you know, download speed, responsiveness, and so on. So here we have something that does a portion of it client side and a portion of it server side. And that's exactly what AJAX is. We're going to do some stuff on the client side, some stuff on the server side. Well, what are we going to do on the client side and what are we going to do on the server side? We're going to do the things that each of those technologies is good for. All right. What is client side good for? Client side is good for changing the content of a page or changing the appearance of the page after the page has been loaded without requiring that the page refreshes itself. That's what client side does. So we're using client side for that. What does the server side do? The server side is good at housing mountains of data, all right, and allowing us to access stuff from that data. We saw just one small example of accessing data from a database in what we went over, I think it was last time, and you have the one assignment to do that. But if you multiply that times 1 million, you know, you'll see what actual applications on the web do. They store a lot of data on the server, and it can be accessed through server-side script. So server holds the data and allows us to access the data. Client side allows us to change the page without reloading the page. So let's go back to one of our earlier assignments. And this is actually AJAX, even though we didn't, I don't know if I called it that or not. Here we have our weather application that you altered. Page looks like this. And boom, it comes up with overcast clouds. Now, this is a good example of AJAX, but the assignment you did was even better example of AJAX. where you typed something in and clicked submit and you got the weather for the area, the area that you typed in for. Why is this AJAX? Because it is using client-side code to update the page. In other words, all the code to update the page and to put in the temperature, etc., is contained in client-side JavaScript. Yet we know that we're not downloading the current weather of every place in the world to our browser to have that accessed client-side. We're going to a web server through an API call to ask for that weather and getting back JSON file. So if we were to look at this, here we're finding all the things on the page, and eventually we go and we display the weather. This is client-side Java code, all right? Because we're using the DOM, document object model, to access the inner HTML of the icon element, the temp element, the description element, and the location element. So that's being accessed through client-side JavaScript. Yet when we make the request by accessing a URL on the server. And we do this via the fetch. All right. What this says is fetch this URL. And when that finishes, do this. And when this finishes, do this, and so on. This is what is known as asynchronous processing. Asynchronous is the first A in AJAX. AJAX stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Asynchronous means that we don't do things at the same time. Like if you're talking to someone on the phone, that's a synchronous conversation. You say something, the other person says something, you say something back, the other person says something back, and so on. You're synchronized, all right? If I send a person a voicemail message, though, that's asynchronized because I make that request for some information or whatever, put it on their answering machine, then when they get the time or when they're able to, they'll listen to my request and call me back. And that might be 15 minutes from now, it might be an hour from now, might be the next day. All right, that's asynchronous because we're not synchronized. We're not doing things at the same time. That's what this code is, because we call this function to pull the data, then we wait for it to have succeeded. Then we do this. Then we wait for that to finish, then we do this. And when that is finished, then we do this. So that's the A in AJAX, asynchronous. So you can see here that we have a mix of client-side and server-side code. What happens, on the server? Well, we don't know. We don't have access to that server, but they've given us the API of how to address that, of what URL request we need to make to get the data that we want. All right, and we access the server and it returns it in JSON format, not XML. XML is one of the formats that can be used to return data from the web server to the client, but it's not the only one. All right, JSON is one. Just plain sequential data or delimited data, or you have comma delimited data or tab delimited data would be another way of doing that. Or sometimes if the application is simple enough, you're only returning one thing. So you don't need to format it in any way. You just return the answer. All right, let's look at first AJAX that's new to this unit. So if you remember this, I have homepage, chart, calculator. I've added two things to this, AJAX and jQuery. The first one is AJAX using just plain JavaScript to do the job. The other one is using jQuery. And it doesn't matter which one we use, all right? You can also use the fetch. Let me double check. Is the fetch part of jQuery or JavaScript? Yeah, the fetch is a more modern way to do it than what I'm going to do. All right. So this example is using a little bit older technology. The fetch is probably the better example to use, but I want to show you the older way of doing it because that's sort of the nuts and bolts of how this works. The fetch sort of wraps things up and makes it easier and more convenient. So I could go and I could type in my age and my number of heartbeats, and it tells me that I'm in the optimal heart range. All right. Now, notice it did that on the same page. So it's like the postback in that sense. Remember, our original calculator took us to a different page. Then we did the postback. Here we're doing AJAX. And what we're doing is we're typing this in, making the request, and we're getting back only this bit. You are in the optimal heart range. So let's look at how this does on a nuts and bolts level. So let's look at check range, calculator AJAX, and check range AJAX. All right. Works similar to before, but if everything's okay, I make the AJAX call. Notice right here at the top, we are creating an object that we're going to use as a pipeline. That HTTP object is going to contain actually an XML HTTP request object. This is very old code left in there just in case someone was using Internet Explorer. Probably get rid of that now because very few people use Internet Explorer. So you could probably get rid of this if statement. What this does is it creates a request object, and that request object is called HTTP and is the pipeline between the JavaScript in this page and the server-side code that's going to run. So we created that pipeline. Make AJAX call. Just like with the fetch, we have a URL. In our case, what do we have to pass to the server to do the calculation of whether they're in the optimal heart range or not? We have to pass their age and we have to pass the number of beats in 6 seconds, I think it was. We form the URL. We call this to sort of make the request or to prepare the request. We tell this object what gets called when the request is completed. This is called a callback function. So what this is saying is it's sort of like the then in the fetch. When this request gets finished, this function is going to get called, the one that I name here. So I prepare the request, I open the pipeline, I say what to do when the request is finished, and then I make the request. That sends the request to the server. Now this is asynchronous, right? So we don't know how long that's going to take for the server to get to it. If the server is very busy, maybe it'll take fractions of a second longer than if the server is not very busy. So when I say it waits, it's not like it's waiting for 15 minutes or something. It's waiting for fractions of a second, provided you have a good internet connection. Finally, this on ready state change, I lied a little bit. It doesn't only get called when the request is finished. It recalls whenever the server gives a status update back to the client. In other words, whenever the server changes the ready state. Now, the ready state says at what stage of the processing it occurs. So there's 4 values. 0 is that the client hasn't prepared the request yet. We haven't called open yet. 1 means that we have opened it. 2 means that we've sent it. 3 means we're getting the data back. Now keep in mind, this could be a lot of data, so that might take a little bit of time. And the status that we're interested in is number 4, indicating, hey, the request has been completed. So if the request is completed, we take the response text, which we get back from the client, and set the inner HTML to whatever results we got from the server. Now I'm going to put some console logs in here, because if there's a problem with this, let me make a problem. I'm going to get rid of that. I think I did it to the wrong version. Yeah. I'm going to deliberately put a problem in here to show you how you can debug this. So I'm going to get rid of this text beats. let me so I have to copy it over. All right. So I run this 22 and there is 10 beats in 6 seconds. All right, we get a goofy answer. It tells us that there's a warning because there's an undefined array key. So we might not be sure what is going on here. I mean, I know because I, constructed the error. So what I would want to do would be this. I would go in and I would put in here console log URL. And that's going to write to the console what the problem is. Or I'm sorry, not what the problem is. It's going to write what the actual URL that we're calling is. If I run this, still gives me that error. I look at the console. See, the log says this is a URL that got called. I can look at that and maybe it will jump out to me that there's no ampersand there. If not, I can run it, the URL, this way. And it tells me it's a PHP warning on line 5. And hopefully then I can look and see that it's assuming there's something in beats and it's not there. So hopefully then I can correct it. But you get the idea. First, I'm going to display the URL that actually gets called, and I'm going to inspect that and make sure that's correct. Once I do that, then I am going to actually put that URL in the address bar to see what results I get, just to make sure I'm getting the right results. And we should be back to normal here. And sure enough, we get the results. So what are the key takeaways in this method? This method, again, is a little more complex than using the fetch protocol. All right, the fetch API. But it does offer some advantages, such as we can test status and display appropriate messages throughout the state. So for example, if we're retrieving a large amount of data, I can check for status 3, the ready state 3, and display some message saying data is being downloaded. So I can inform the user about what's going on. Whereas it doesn't appear that you can easily do that in the fetch. Maybe I'm missing something with that. I'm less familiar with the fetch than I am doing it this method. But again, the basic idea of this. We have an object that forms the pipeline. It is, strictly speaking, an XML HTTP request. And we do that regardless of whether we're getting XML back or not. All right. That's just part of the name, and that's what they anticipated would be used, was XML. But now people use JSON, people use plain text or whatever. One thing I should show you when I correct it, I can then copy this URL and run it to see what response I get back from the server. Because we have 3 components here. We have the client, we have the server, then we have the client again. The client is responsible for making a request. The server is responsible for processing a request and returning the results. And then the client is responsible for formatting the results and displaying it the way that the client wants to. Now, if we look at the server-side script that processes this, check range PHP, AJAX PHP, you'll notice that it includes the include files, but it doesn't have any HTML in it. The only thing it does is it outputs this, one of these 3 things, or it prints that there's an error message. And the error message is up here. It's like we strip from the code that we were using before on the server side any of the extra HTML stuff, because this doesn't output HTML. This is just outputting data. And in this case, it's outputting one piece of data, either the results or an error. Now, this can also be done using jQuery. And if I demonstrate that, the results are going to be about the same. Well, exactly the same. Server side is the same. The client's going to be different though, because we're using jQuery to process the request and to make the request. So here we've included the jQuery library. And we make the AJAX call this way. We do the same thing. We formulate the URL. We make the AJAX request, and if it's successful, we call this function to display the results. Now, there's a couple other examples that we will not have time to go over in detail, but I did want to introduce them to you. One of them is a dictionary example. And in a real life application, this would be done with a database. But in our case, we're just using an array. There's also a quiz example. This is a fun assignment. No, that's not what I want. Oh, I enabled the wrong stuff. This one should be enabled. I'm going to make this one an extra credit. As an extra challenge. I'll talk about that in a second. I have a AJAX quiz. Now, if you think about a quiz, you wouldn't want to download in JavaScript the answers to the quiz, because a savvy person would simply view source and be able to see what the answers are. So it makes sense that the answers to the quiz are on the server side. Where you have a quiz where you enter the data. And you get the grade. I got half of them right, 50%. We look at the code here, and again, I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but if you look at the code where I make the quiz, I make a request, and I concatenate to the URL all the answers. Then I make the request. I have an alert here. You can also use a console log to see the value of the URL. In this case, the key thing is I'm getting back data that's delimited by a comma. So I'm splitting that so I can count up the number of Y's and N's that are in that, because the server side returns a Y if they got the question right, an N if they got it wrong. Another example. And I've done this one like 3 different ways, showing delimited data, which is data that the values are separated by commas or tabs, or I think I use a semicolon. this actually makes 2 AJAX requests. And again, I'm not using a database here, but it's similar to a database in that it's a big array that lives on the server side. So a realistic example would actually have the data in a database. But to keep things simple, I have it in a big array. As I type in letters, it'll show me a list of words that start with that letter. So I type in A, D, for example, and I have addition. If I click that and then click go, it shows me the Spanish version of that word. I do this again with delimited data, JSON data, and XML data. So take a minute to look at those. Here are assignments for this. One of them is easy. One of them, the extra credit one's a little bit challenging. The assignment that is actually due, that's not extra credit, requires you to do the tuition calculation on the tuition calculator using AJAX. So you'll create a page that either uses a fetch protocol or creates the XML HTTP object and makes a request, gets the results back, and displays it on the page. The optional one is kind of fun, and this really brings everything together. If I were smart, I would have made this the final exam. There is no final exam in this class, but if I was smart, I would have made this problem by itself the final exam. And that is to create a page that has a text box for name. As the user enters each character using AJAX, call a PHP script that recalls all the customers from the database in Lab 11 whose names match the character at the beginning. For example, if the user types in a DA, that would match Davis but not Adams. I have some links here to help you. I also have this example, which does something similar that you can take a look at. But this is not required, it's extra credit. And if you have time, give it a shot. If not, no big deal. We were approximately a week behind in this class. We fell a little bit behind. And I had not until recently included the database interactivity through AJAX as part of this class. And I did that the last couple of terms, but this term we hit the end before we were able to get that. But I still want to offer you the opportunity to do that as an extra credit assignment. All right, remember that next week there's no lecture. I'll be posting an announcement that will confirm that, and we'll also talk about some important end of the semester dates. If there's no questions, that's all I had for today. We'll see you around.